Maison Roche, as first a building, it's very special to what architecture in France represents. When we think of Le Corbusier, I think a lot of the times we just speak on his project as an architect, but Le Corbusier was also a painter and a sculptor. So for me, being in conversation with an artist that lived in a time where I wasn't even an idea yet, I think the fact that he was looking at African art for inspiration for his design, his use of color, but also sculptures is something that I think I fully wanted to answer or relate to as well. And as a young African artist, coming from the source of where he used to borrow from, and having my work be in conversation not only with Le Corbusier but also with the house, because showing in a space like Maison La Roche is very different than showing in a white cube gallery, because in a white cube, your works are just your works. But whenever you show in this place like Maison La Roche, it becomes two things. The work influenced the space, and then the space influenced the work. So while working on this body of work, I was trying to be intentional on how I wanted my work to influence the space, but then I wasn't fully aware till we hung the show on how the space would also influence my work. A lot of these works, I was only living with them in my studio in such a closed environment for almost a year. So seeing them coming from the studio, now I'm looking around and just seeing how even just the colors are in conversation with the space, the way Le Corbusier was using color in space himself. So it's very exciting for me just to have the works hanging here. Before we started working on the show, I spent a lot of time in Le Corbusier's archive. And I was fascinated by his use and understanding of color. I think within my work, I've always been intentional with my color usage. But with this show, I wanted the colors to somewhat vibrate with the same intensity as the building and as the space. It almost seemed like there's a beautiful harmony happening between space, color, and the relationship that they have together. The most important thing that art does is give us or allow us to look into new possibilities, into how could we further conversations. So the title What If was important for me because while working on this show, the question was always what if, and my first idea was what if a family of color was living in a space like this? What would that look like? What would that feel like? Again, questioning new possibilities and wanting to arrive at new avenues or different avenues of seeing or experiencing a space that has been part of French architectural history. I wanted to not change the space, but again, what if the space could feel and look different? With this subject matter, I wanted to be intentional on how I represent, the black figure, because when we think of this space, this was not made for any black figures, historically. I wanted to represent these figures at moment of leisure, moment of quietness, moments of intimacy within them. When we think of a home, it's a safe space, it's a warm space. So I wanted these figures to also feel like they were at home within their inner psychology. I, myself as a black man, I've traveled and lived in so many different spaces, and I'm always influenced by the space that I inhabit, and as a black man, it's hard to travel without being reminded of your blackness sometimes. I always try to capture within my works what's happening internally, but also in front of me. For these works, I was very intentional in painting people that I knew, or also people that I just met here in Paris. And I think while capturing these people, it already speaks onto the politics that they're living under, or the systems that they're living within this country. I think for me, this is how politics have a way of filtering through my work. Again, migrating from Cameroon to the United States, I was introduced to a new history, the history of African Americans. And because of the way I look, I was viewed as an African American by default. I managed to fold myself within that context, but after leaving the United States and relocating to France, I was faced with the history of Black Europeans now, which at first was a bit of a maze to figure out. But I think, again, because I've lived in so many different spaces, I'm very adept with things like this. And it was just interesting to see how Black people as a whole, we've always managed to figure out what the idea of home is for us, coming from the continent of Africa to the United States to Europe, we've always managed to, throughout history, make a space for ourselves. And I think this was what I was trying to make also with this show, but also with my move to Europe. I wanted to make a space for myself where I think I belong. And then with these paintings within this house too, I wanted to make space for them so that they could feel like they belong in this space as well.